And thanks for being here so bright and early this morning, because this is a subject very dear to my heart, and I believe to yours as well, because that's why you're here. And when we first got together, Agnes and Elsa and I, on text and emails and phone calls to talk about this session, the broad subject of keeping communities safe for women could take us in so many directions, because there are so many places in which women are vulnerable in all communities. But we're going to specifically focus on India and Africa, as those are the two countries represented by the two extraordinary and courageous women who are on this panel. But let's begin with the universal statistic about how unsafe the world is for women everywhere. The UN statistic is 1 in 3 women will face an incident of sexual violence or attack in their lifetime. We know that figure is low, because that only includes the reported cases of sexual attacks. Elsa shared with me earlier this morning that in India, every 18 minutes, a woman is raped. Take that in. And that doesn't include all the other forms of violence that women face. And it's social, cultural, as well as physical violence. So what ElsaMarie D'Silva from India, who flew in from Mumbai just yesterday to be with us, and Agnes Igoye from Uganda, who many of us have had the privilege to know and to work with as one of Aspen's new fellows, new voices, joins us to give their perspective from their communities. And in our conversation, what I think you'll find relevant no matter where we live as a woman or a man concerned about the safety of women, is that there are certain common factors that have led us to this state of fear and violence against women. So let's start with the home, because it is in the home where women either feel safe or not, either learn to be valued or not, find their own agency or not. Elsa, what is home as a central driving force for the way in which women perceive themselves and their place in the community?
Thanks, Pat. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
You know, the home is supposed to be a place where you're supposed to feel safe and secure, right? I'll share one statistic with you. Right now in India, we have 37 million men more than women. And with China, it's 70 million men more than women. And why is that? It's because right from the time you're in the womb, you are being killed. There's femicide happening on a scale that is so large that we are not even now, these numbers have appeared now, but it's taken a while to reach this stage, and it's manifesting itself in so many other issues. So in India, for example, whilst we have a law that bans you from determining the sex of your child whilst in the womb, people still find ways to determine whether they're carrying a woman, a girl or a boy child, and they're killing off the girls. And we have atrocious sex ratios in several states. And it's not limited to illiterate states. Bombay, which is literally the financial capital of the country, has one of the worst sex ratios in the country. So what does that tell you? That, your home, the family that you're born into, is really critical for you as a woman, because today if I'm here, it's thanks to my family. I always say that, it's a birth lottery, that I was born in the family that I was born into. But not many women and girls are fortunate like me to be able to explore, first of all, to be born, then to be educated and have, a healthy existence, and then be given a choice to exercise their choices in every part of their life, whether it is, the education that they receive, the career they pick, the man they marry or not, and so on and so forth. So I do believe that, we are not even talking about these kind of discussions, whether, You know, is your home really secure for you? We talk about domestic violence, you know, which is one of the biggest forms of sexual violence. But what, I mean, till a few years ago, that term did not even exist. But I feel by having a blanket term, domestic violence, we are actually not breaking it down into the several different forms of violence that can exist even within that small unit called the family in the home. And to me, that is problematic, and we need to have these discussions so that we can unpack it and strive for a truly equal place within that home.
And it begins with the value that a girl child feels from day one.
Yes.
Your value was obviously given to you from your family. You felt it from your family. And Agnes, we know from hearing your story how unusual your home situation was because of the support and value that your father gave to you. But on a general basis, looking at the country of Uganda, where does the home factor in and the way girl childs find their value and agency in the world?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning about, my father, because I want to say that despite the fact that my father, was so supportive and loved his girls, but he had also so much pressures, from his own community. And I remember, the story about my birth. My birth was a scandal. And my paternal auntie, whom my father follows, was the first to the hospital. And her agenda was to find out the sex of the baby. So she opened and said, oh my goodness, this is another date, like, a person in Bobo in my language. Because, girls are useless and girls are not worth educating. And then she spread the bad news, to the village. And my mother had to be called names and all that. So she's a woman, but these things are structural within the community. And despite the fact that my father was very supportive and even refused to divorce her because we ended up 6 girls in a row, there was still pressure. And I always keep saying, because of that pressure, we had to pray, literally, like kneel on our knees, reciting the rosary, like I said, to pray that my mother should have a boy so that she becomes the heir. So the pressures were still there, because even if you're married to a man who is supportive, you have all this, village, to deal with. And as growing up, you learn very quickly, because by the time about the age 10, people gave me another name. They called me Amalayat, which means prostitute. And I kept on asking my mother, what does this word mean? And, because I was so persistent, then she told me. And I remember vividly, and that's when I made her that promise that, Mommy, I'm going to work really, really very hard and embarrass this man by succeeding in life. And so those pressures are there.
Done.
Yes. And coming to the overall picture, for Uganda, of course, child marriages, are very prevalent, even not just in my village, but, elsewhere. Because before the age of 18, you're really married off. I have many people who are now grandmothers, people I grew up, with. And so what also helped, that's why in our Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act of 2009, we included child marriage as a form of violence, against, children and as human trafficking, because it is prevalent. So the family really is very, very important and critical.
Both of you were fortunate enough to come into families where, in spite of the customs and in spite of the way in which most of the rest of the community was treating girl childs, you had exceptional childhoods. And Elsa, you and I were talking about, even though you were educated, you went on to seek a career and have an extraordinary career in the aviation business, becoming a vice president of a major aviation company. But even among educated, privileged Indian women, there was still this lack of value from inside that led to, or added to, a sense of women as commodity within a larger culture. Can you talk about that?
In my country, for example, I think your identity is very closely linked to your father and then to your husband. and all the forms that you fill ask you for these two names, you know, daughter of or wife of. And what happens to a single person like me? You know, why do I have to always be linked with a man? You know, but having said that, I do believe that the worth of a woman is always seen in context with, you know, the person that she's associated with, either the father, the husband, or later in life, your son. And that needs to change because women are more and more being educated. They are being financially independent, and they want more from life. They want to be treated as equal. You know, but when you look around, when I look around me in India, we have, for the first time, lots of women graduating. It's the highest number of women graduates ever. But the number in the labor force is decreasing. Why is that? Why is that? You know, shouldn't more women be in the workforce? Our Prime Minister and his government are talking about women economic empowerment, and all the corporates are spending CSR budgets on life skilling and, you know, helping women to enter the workforce. And they are struggling because they will impart all these life skills, but women are not taking up these jobs. And the latest McKinsey study, if you've read it, says that by 2025, if we achieve true gender equality, the global GDP of the world will be $18 trillion, out of which $770 billion comes from India alone. So gender equality is good for the economy, yet it's not translating into action. And to me, that is because there are certain structural reasons, coming back to the family, coming back to the community. One is your personal safety. When you leave your home, are you really safe? On the way to work, in the transportation system, and then further at work. That is one. Second is the share of the household work and the family care between the man and the woman in that household. In India, we are still not talking about LGBTQ rights. So bear with me if I don't mention that often. But in our family home, again, another study by, I think, McKinsey themselves said that women in India on an average do 5 hours of household work more than their male counterparts, which means you go, you do your full day's work, and then you go home and you do another 5 hours or 6 hours of family care. And that leaves her with absolutely no time for herself. She has no energy, she has no time, she has no bandwidth. So, you know, when it is convenient, you know, it's easy for a woman to be told, stay at home rather than go out and work. We will provide for you, we will protect you, you don't have to leave. And therefore, if you want to change that, you're actually taking on all those systems. Like you said, your family was progressive, but your surrounding community would have probably put all those pressures. Similarly, over here, in our country, it's unthought of that for a man to probably sit at home and look after the children. It's expected that it's a woman's job. And even if a man, and in that family, the husband decides to do that, the larger society will say, what is wrong with you? Are you incapable? And they'll put a lot of pressure on that man. So you have to battle all these societal structures. And therefore, when we're talking of community, I think it's important to note that sexual violence or gender equality is not only a woman's issue. It is an entire societal issue, and it must be looked like from that lens.
And we're going to come back to how you are specifically addressing that. How big is the fear of personal safety as a factor in the fact that so many of these educated women are still choosing not to go into the economy?
So, again, I come from the aviation industry, and we are, in that industry, situational awareness is very high. But when it comes to your personal safety, we very rarely look at our situational awareness. So, again, when it comes to India, I live in Bombay, so we think, oh, Bombay is a pretty safe city as compared to Delhi. But we won't look at it in itself and say, are we happy with the situation in Bombay? And since we do a lot of workshops in schools, colleges, with communities, and even in corporates, yes, safety is a growing concern because we are talking about, 20 million population in these cities. It's already the infrastructure is, strained. And it's only going to get worse because, again, by 2050, they say 70% of the world's populations are going to be in these cities. And Bombay, Delhi, and many other Indian cities are going to be in the top 10. If it is already crowded, and in such situations, women are, more vulnerable than men to groping, touching, and other forms of sexual violence, it's only going to get worse. And then when you have more men than women, you're going to see less of your own kind. It's going to be intimidating, and you don't know how they're going to react. Like somebody asked me, if there are more men than women, shouldn't they treat you like precious, I don't know, he didn't use the word commodities, but shouldn't they treat you well? And I'm like, no, because they actually don't like us. If they liked us, we wouldn't have this problem. So unfortunately, the ratio is not to our advantage.
And definitely threatening and intimidating in so many of the public situations. So Agnes, you mentioned that you moved into this extraordinary work of looking at the huge challenge in Uganda and so many other places in the world of sex trafficking. And talk to us about making that decision and bringing child marriage into the issue of trafficking, something that was very pioneering on your part. How are you then addressing, rescuing, giving women options, giving them a way to safety out of such a violent situation?
Thank you very much. That decision to get into the field of human trafficking really runs deep into my childhood, fleeing the Lord's Resistance Army who invaded my home and targeting me and my sisters for sexual exploitation. And so running and just following the crowd and finally ending up an internally displaced people's camp in a Catholic mission. So that journey and the thoughts that kept on going on my head, and later going on through that experience to do a master's and do research on the role of the family in the rehabilitation of children who were abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army. So that's how it all began, and the choice of joining immigration service and becoming a border guard. That's I remember I was at the border between Uganda and Kenya at Busia, where I and my colleague, we actually, years later, causing the arrest of one of the commanders of the Lord's Resistance Army. And I remember it was, about 11:30, and there was no electricity, there was blackout, and I think he was so deliberate about the timing of his movement. But having lived through those experiences and being able to identify him, among that, and this is a man who had killed people, in northern Uganda and cooked the flesh and fed on the villagers. And all of a sudden, seeing this dangerous man in front of me and try to keep my cool, so not to let him know that I've got to know that who he is. And later on meeting, the Minister of Internal Affairs, and he's like, okay, how did you do this? Because there's a lot of excitement. That was before the peace talks. And then I told then, the minister that you can actually, identify, you can deliberately train people, to identify. Shortly after, that's when I became, the first training manager for the, immigration service. And now, translating that, being the first woman to head Uganda's Immigration Training Academy and having this multi-agency training team composed of military, police, and immigration, and deliberately training, border guards, law enforcement on how to identify. Because the thing is, with victims of human trafficking, they can't self-identify. Because first of all, they don't know that they are victims. They've lied to them. For example, their jobs, abroad. And when you get there, that's when you get to know that actually it's into, prostitution, sex, slavery. So, while I was doing that work, that's how I wanted to tell you how I got to build the Dream Revival Center. because rescuing, survivors, I ended up, taking them to my house because I had nowhere to take them. One survivor really rings deep. She called me about midnight, crying, didn't know where she was, and then I told her, look for the next gas station. And then I picked her up. This is a girl who was circumcised as a child and married off before she healed. And after years of abuse, she managed to leave, and the parents were furious because she brought shame to the family. You don't leave your marriage no matter what. And bringing her to my house and not having where to take her, and 4 days later, because you get uncomfortable living with people, I find her gone. That really hit deep. And I said, I have to build a center. That's how I ended up building it, and to really have women have this safe place, to stay and have rehabilitation work, going on. So those are like deliberate steps which go back, to really my childhood.
I just want to say that we could take a long time just to honor the fact that you escaped from that situation intact, and from the horror of being imprisoned really yourself, to seeing that this was a problem you could start to address. And I know, and in your work now, as you say, the women don't self-identify that they are in an unsafe, violent, harmful situation, often trafficked, often trapped in an abusive marriage. How do you go about then identifying them and getting them out? How do you get them to your center? And how have you employed other women in that process to help you?
It's various ways, because we have to know that you have to empower, frontline, officials. And frontline means, either you're a social worker somewhere, if you're a doctor somewhere and somebody has come in that they have malaria, very critical. They may have, that scar on the arm, and ask further questions. If they are being escorted, by somebody, make sure that you interview them by themselves, because they'll be fearful and they will not tell you the truth about what is happening, whether they are safe at home or not. If you're a police officer and you're responding, whether it's a homicide or whatever it is, be critical to identify who is that person living in that neighborhood, who might be in that corner, who might be, because there's domestic servitude. There are so many levels. There's, in our law, child marriage, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, removal of organs, sometimes not just for transplant, but for witchcraft, and, yes, and to harm your enemies. So somebody can, including rich people, you are supposed to have a construction like this, but the witch doctor tells you we need a heart or certain organ, of a child or whatever. So you have to kill them to be able to bury it so that you become successful in future. So some people really think that way. And so you have to really be vigilant. So it's not just border guards at the immigration control, it's in the homes, it's about your neighborhood, it's to be each other's keeper. So it's us to identify. If you live in a neighborhood and you see that girl or what, who is constantly under control, who can't get out, who is always escorted, by somebody, there's some things that ring a bell. And it's our responsibility, to report, to authorities and be each other's keeper.
And I think it's important to point out that all these things that you are now doing, the training, the identification, every step of interaction with these victims and survivors, how are they rescued? This was all new. This system didn't exist in this community. You have created. Yeah,
before, and working with different, stakeholders. I mean, even the UN started just talking about Palermo Protocol in 2000, but doesn't mean that there was no trafficking before then. Trafficking happened, and they're just giving a title to it. And right now, it's really important to put legislation in place, because there are some countries who even, don't have legislation. And what you may call trafficking, they may call it, something else. And there are some people who think slavery is okay, that you can have somebody in your house and treat them like, worse than even, our pets, the animals, and all that. And that is very important. because we have to recognize that it's happening, globally. And it's not just an African thing, but also US. This is 40 billion people, according to International Labour Organization, annually. And, and 71%, women and girls enslaved, and 99%, of them in the sexual, industry. So we are looking at a very big, number of people across the world, and it happens in every country. Every state in the US. I've done, state tours here, and you have runaway kids, you have people in agriculture, but it's also to educate ourselves, because where does your clothing come from? Where does your chocolate come from? And to have companies, accountable to their supply chains and make sure that they are clean.
Agnes, so grateful for this work. Is it replicable, the system you have set up in Uganda? Could that be set up in other countries, both throughout the continent of Africa, but other places?
Yes, I think we have to start with mapping out what trafficking looks like in your country. Because in mine, for example, if we have the use of children in armed conflict, you may not have it here in the US, where you have child marriages. So to really include it in your law, and yes, it can be mapped out, because we all have, responsibilities, to play. The most critical thing is to be able to network and have collaborations, even in country, because a medical doctor will have an input which is different from law enforcement. NGOs should work, with government. It's something you can't do on your own, and you have to work with other countries, because if you think your place is safe, if another country is not dealing with it, because, people need jobs, it translates. And this is a $150 billion industry, annually. That's how much they make. And when you have them make that amount of money, you really have to inject money to counter. And we have to be really, really networked, because you know what? Traffickers are afraid when we unite in action.
Right. And I want to come back and talk about how other women, have you brought other women into this work too? Yeah. Elsa, looking at how you have made your community safer for women, giving up a career, setting up a foundation. Talk to us about the specific ways in which Red Dot Foundation is addressing the issue of safety for women.
So how many of you heard of the horrific gang rape of Jyoti Singh on a bus in Delhi a few years ago? Okay, so at that time, even I was shocked about the incident, and everywhere we went in India, in the media, on TV, in public settings, etc., private settings, all we could talk about was this gang rape and how brutal and horrific it was. And, it led to, curfew in Delhi, because citizens were out on the streets protesting. We had marches all over the country, etc., for the first time on this issue. And I wanted to do something concrete, and my way was to launch a crowd map called Safe City, which we were using to crowdsource personal stories, anonymous stories of sexual violence in public spaces. And the reason for that was because when I started to research this issue, I couldn't find any data except for that one UN statistic, 1 in 3 women on an average. But what I was hearing was pretty much every woman I spoke to had a story to share. This incident also brought back all the memories of my own personal experiences, which I had kind of forgotten and had, filed deep into the back of my mind. And I wanted to use that data to find local solutions. So what we do is we ask people to share their stories. These are then collated as location-based trends visualized on a map. And we are then able to pinpoint what is happening where. So for example, mapping of trafficking in every country, right? Similarly, public space harassment is different in every country. It's different in every city. And we are already seeing trends between Delhi and Bombay which are different. Within a city, different neighborhoods are showing different kinds of sexual violence. And we use that information to engage and start the dialogue with communities to find local solutions. So for example, if we work with an NGO in a community, we present the data and the trends to that community, and we say, okay, now that you know what's happening, what is it that you want to do about it? And it's for them to come up with the solutions. In my country, unlike yours in the US, we do not have open data. So if you wanted crime statistics, and in particular crime against women, you will get a country level number, which does not tell you, the breakdown of it. It doesn't tell you in your own locality what is happening. So it's hard for you to engage and be part of the solution. But with us, it's a complementary data set that you can use. And I find that this has actually helped us engage with the police. The police have thanked us because they said, no, I don't know about here, but in my country, nobody goes to the police station to make complaints because it's an intimidating space. And then if you go there, the police may or may not be sensitive to you. So, it's just such a hassle that people say, why engage at all? So, but the downside is you do not document your experience. And if you don't document it, in fact, it never happened. So it's very important for you to document it and make a repository of that data so that it can be used. Once that data is available, then you can engage the police, you can engage the municipal authorities, you can engage transportation authorities to find solutions. Or religious leaders, like in Kibera, my partner at Safe City was able to bring in the religious authorities. There was a hotspot on one of the busy roads where these young girls were being groped on their way to school. So much so that they were going to drop out of their school. They didn't want to go there. And she looked around that space, and there was a mosque. And she said, okay, can I call that imam in? She called him in, showed him the data, and he started advocating in his sermons and talking to the young men about what is appropriate and not. It had an instant effect. They stopped indulging in that behavior. So when you have localized data, you can bring in the right stakeholders to have that dialogue with. Secondly, the community, back to the community. In Delhi, one of the hotspots was near a tea stall. A tea stall in India, if you've never been there, is a small kiosk on the side of a road where men hang around and drink their tea. Why I say men? Because usually it's a men-dominated space. No woman has the time to stand there having their tea. So these men will hang out over there, gossip and stare and comment on the women and girls passing by, which was really intimidating. And so when presented with the data, we asked them, what would you like to do with it? They said, we want the staring to stop. Again, if you haven't been to Delhi, the constant male gaze in North India can be extremely intimidating. And we said, okay, now how does one address this? How many men are you going to put behind bars? You can't put the whole population.
Not 37 million, you can't.
So we decided, with an art collective to have an art workshop, and these women painted their feelings on the wall, which included staring eyes, big staring eyes, and a lot of subtle messaging in English and Hindi that said, look with your heart, not with your eyes, we won't be intimidated by your gaze, we will break our silence, we will speak up, etc. And mind you, these are women who don't know how to read and write. Probably for the first time have taken up a paintbrush and are putting their feelings on the wall, because in our culture it's hard to confront a male authority figure. But it had again an instant effect. Within a week, the staring and loitering stopped. Some journalists didn't believe me. They went to interview the community over there, and they found that the community decided that this was no longer appropriate for them, that they were now going to have the back of these women and girls. So sometimes, because of the silence around this issue, we don't talk about it, we don't talk to our girlfriends about it, so we don't talk to the larger community about it, and we don't report it. This silence that is created, makes this issue invisible, even though we know it's happening. And so therefore, it's important to have that data. And I can give you many examples how this has been used. Lots of low-cost interventions that have worked, mainly community-driven. We've been able to engage with stakeholders like, transportation authorities in Nepal that issued women-only bus licenses. Now, you may say women-only bus licenses is segregating, the transport. But in my view, if you don't have a choice, and if that situation doesn't really empower a woman to travel by public transport, what are you going to do? You have to find an alternative.
So how would you assess the level of accomplishment where Red Dot and Safe Cities is now? How much impact have you been able to have from the low-level interventions to the higher level?
So one is we have the largest crowd map in the world on this topic with 11,000 stories. Now you'll say 11,000 is a drop in the ocean. I agree, but there is no other data set like this. And therefore, having it in the public domain is so important because people cannot ignore it any longer. See, when you go with your individual story, it's very hard for you to prove it. This is the only crime I can tell you where you have the onus as the victim to prove your innocence. The perpetrator gets away scot-free. So when you go with your story, they always put it back saying you were at the wrong place at the wrong time, you were wearing the wrong clothing, you did this, that, and the other, right? But when you can show even 5 incidents took place in that same location over and over again, nobody is going to dispute that. We have found that to be powerful. So we have, in a way, started a lot of conversation on sexual violence in India. We have shown through our pilots in several cities and now in different countries that you can engage not only with the community but different stakeholders to find those solutions. And third is we are now getting requests from different countries as well as places to collect the data first and then use the data in many ways. So for example, Malaysia is our new partner. We have a partner in KL, Kuala Lumpur. In that country, they do not have any legislation on sexual violence in public spaces. So they are starting their project for the first time to collect women's stories so that they can use it as evidence to make that case for the legislation. I think that is powerful.
Very powerful. And the same, in each of your countries, there are actually laws that's supposed to be protecting and making communities safe for women. They're just not implemented. And Agnes, in the case of human trafficking, and in particular the way it affects women and girls, we know how big the problem is. What have been the biggest challenges for you in putting forth and making successful the training, recruiting, identifying, and healing the victims of sexual trafficking?
Challenges would require us to start this session all over again.
Yeah.
but I'll try. But I also want to appreciate that we are not where we used to be. There's been, progress. Because when you look at, human trafficking, you have to do the holistic approach. The best thing is, of course, to prevent it, from happening, which means that, you have to lower down levels of unemployment because that's the catchword. The trafficker will say that you need a job. And, of course, you'll say yes. And then when they take you wherever the job is, it's some other job. And then there are control mechanisms involved. They remove your document from you. Maybe you don't speak the language. They make you fearful of the police. So there's a whole web, on why women cannot run away. And then, of course, the protection bit, because if you're already trafficked, you need the protection. And that means we have to have safe places, shelter, which is really, really lacking. And to really empower those women. Like I always say, let's move beyond the basic needs. Let's not just give them shelter and what, but really give them that skill so that they don't go back to that cycle. And that comes in with even the economics. And then you have to really prosecute people because right now there are more survivors and victims than people who have been taken up to court and locked up. And we are really not tapping into what survivors can do to help us, because you don't expect me to go to court when I'm sick, when I don't have a roof over my head, when I'm fearful that somebody's running after me, but you want me to go and testify. That could be not the first immediate thing, for me. So we have to really empower them to really help us go through those processes. And the biggest is really those partnerships we need, because this is a global challenge, and it's intertwined. These are transnational organized crime networks. They have money, and they are channeling, resources even to other things, including terrorism, including drug trafficking. They use the victims to do those things. So it's all intertwined, and we have to be concerned because a lot of money which is not taxed and powerful, they can influence the politics. They can influence who is the mayor and whoever is in what. So traffickers are not just people out there. They live among us. You can be working with them and you do not know, because this is a lot of money, that people channel in. So it's really, really critical. And also women to support each other. I've seen myself through my journey. Some of the people who have really come on my way to sabotage the things I do are women. which is very unfortunate because it's a struggle, because these are women in leadership. Sometimes they block, your way, because, you need a platform to do certain things. But if they don't allow you to get into it, it's a problem. So it's not just, and I've seen men who support me in certain spaces than women, themselves. So really, as women, there's so much to do. You can't finish trafficking. Come on, there's so many places if you want to shine, but don't block other women, to do the work, to bring this into light. So let's really support each other, in this process.
I'd like to add to that, so when I started, I was working on the crowdsourced data part, right? And 5 years ago, crowdsourced data was not even an accepted data set. And I got a lot of pushback actually from the women, because I did not come from the women's movement in India. And they were like, oh, you can't actually solve this problem using that. And I was like, but the problem is so big. Let's find different ways. The journey to achieve it is, different paths. But together we can have a greater impact. And it's taken me 5 years to get some kind of acceptance, when now they are willing to have me sit on the same panels as them and talk about it.
I have to say, this is the saddest moment in every conversation I ever have about women. It just breaks my heart that when you hear from people who are putting their lives and their everything on the line to help other women, and you hear the report back, I'm not getting the support that I need from other women.
And actually, there are lots of men who want to support. So I want to put it on record that not all men are perpetrators of violence. But a lot of men, unfortunately, are silent bystanders. And in the work that I do, data speaks to them. So I've been able to engage a lot, including police officers. So even before I approached them, they were already scanning my website for trends and for the data. So now we share with 3 police forces our data officially, and I know at least 3 or 4 others that are getting the data directly from our website. So I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of good men out there. We just need to figure out how to get them to be part of this solution.
There are a lot of good women out there too,
Yes.
who are standing up for each other. So let's let some of the good women and men in this room have a question, and I'm going to take 2 or 3 at one time very quickly. I'll come to you next. This is my husband. I'm going to give him a chance to. Do you mind if I let him go first? It's favoritism, I know.
I never ask questions.
Yes, indeed he is.
I never ask questions in sessions like this, but something occurs to me as I listen to both of you, and that is the problem with sex trafficking is the people that are buying the sex. And it seems to me like in this day where we have cameras like I've been taking photographs along here, that it's very, very easy to set up a website and broadcast pictures of men who are using these things.
Services.
Catch them going in and put them on screen, because without them, without these customers, then there is no more market that you're talking about. I mean, I didn't overlook your comment about using sex trafficking domestically or something like that, but I think basically we need to stop men from thinking that it's okay to use these things when it actually
Quickly, yeah.
I think
you.
it has to start from the home, from when they are young. I've seen situations where if it's a girl and a boy and you're growing up, they'll say, oh, the woman is always, be careful, wear this and what, be careful. No one is telling the boys on how to treat the women they meet out there. It's like, oh, yeah, he's just being a boy. So it starts from there. That's where they will appreciate. Because young boys, it's cut and paste in what their parents are doing and what other men are doing. When they called me prostitute in my village when I was a young kid, it's both children, boys and big men calling me that. So it's like it is an endorsement. So we have to start from there. We can take the picture, but that's already too late because it has happened. And it becomes an acceptable, kind of culture. So let's learn how to help our boys, on how to treat women and how to be really what a good man needs to be when they grow up.
But you could take pictures,
Yes,
right?
yes, the
Technology,
technology,
is helping and
yes.
is being deployed.
Exactly,
So,
yeah.
yes, and then I'm going to take two more quickly.
Yeah.
I'll just be very quick. My name is Karatulayan, and I was the first woman in the Pakistan Air Force. So I was just, no matter how cool that is, but I was the frontline victim of sexual harassment. So I want to talk about when we say that there are good men and, in the communities. Military is a very patriarchal space within a patriarchal society like Pakistan, where nobody talks about sexual harassment, although there is a Me Too movement all over the world. And coming from India, I want to ask that, how do you, and when I come to these conversations like around the world, they're just mostly women in these rooms. Don't you think that we need to, engage even the bad men in these conversations? And how do we do that?
So in India, we have a law, saying it's prevention of sexual harassment of women at the workplace. It doesn't include men, though a lot of companies have a zero tolerance policy for all their employees. And when we do those sessions, it's mainly for male employees. Again, because of the ratio of men and women, but irrespective of, we've done it for several different industries. We have mainly male members in the room. And, a lot of them act, maybe in ignorance or not, that they have never heard about sexual violence. Now, that could be because we don't have sex ed in our school curriculum. We don't talk about it in the home. We don't talk about it in social circles. We don't talk about it as partners. So there is a silence around the issue, which we need to acknowledge. So you're right. And we invest a lot of our time in this dialogue and this process to engage men. And data really helps us open that conversation, because no man wants their family to be vulnerable to these kind of sexual violence. No man living in a community wants to be seen as a perpetrator or promote that. So we have to, you can say that, they need to know it and we expect them to do so, but I take the stance that let's help them do it and let's, get them into the fold and actually walk them through what it means to be an active bystander and walk in solidarity with you.
Education, yes, here, this gentleman.
Thank you so much, Elsa, and thank you so much, Agnes. And I come from Lahore, Pakistan, and the things you're talking, it's just like culture in every Eid and every Diwali in our city. There are gangs of boys, even I come from boys, and there are last 10 days, Kuratulan knows, when people just go to tease girls, to fondle them, to twist their things and and it's just part of thing. It's just people talk normally, standing on this chai wala that I did this and I did that. But there is another interesting way, like there's so much things happening within the family, even uncles, even so much, just like terrorizing and traumatizing these little female children. And one case is like my sister. She was just she eloped, and when she came, and she was tortured in many ways, and I was the eldest, and I was supposed to kill her, and and these things are taken care of, and people go to their panchayat, and they talk very proudly like, we are very honorable men, we did that. And even it is in Pakistan case, it is in Quran, in every it says you should be taking care of your woman, and if she doesn't do that, you should beat her, and there are certain degrees. So it's just not it's just thing, it's so perpetually structured in society, and it...
Thank you. Yeah, we didn't even get to the whole question of unpacking cultural traditions and policies, which we know is huge. Jennifer, Dan, we're going to have to be very brief.
Very quick, what shocked me was the gender imbalance. You said 37 million more men than women in India, and such and such in China. With that kind of gender imbalance, I think that it's a natural equation for violence, because we have biological imperatives to have sex. So what will happen then?
It's a deep concern. Can we come back to what you might suggest? Okay, to there. It has to be a question, quick.
It's actually a question for you, Pat. There's a lot of gender lens investing going on at the moment, a huge amount of investment in women, and I think that's fantastic. But for every 50 organizations I hear about that are trying to tackle empowerment for women, I hear about one that is trying to educate men to achieve the same things.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, what do you think can be done to try and encourage maybe even those same funds to fund that same, to fund boys' education?
Such a good point. All I can say to that answer is I completely agree with you. We ought to be doing more of that. It's wonderful that Elsa has made that a big part of Safe Cities and their work, and Agnes is doing it. She's literally training the men in Uganda to have a whole different approach to every aspect of trafficking. Quick answer, but yes.
Thank you very much, ladies. I'm sitting here and I'm saying you are very right. The fact that we do not know that these things are happening in our countries, it doesn't mean that they don't exist.
Yeah.
For a very long time, I grew up thinking that albinos don't die, they just disappear. And as I grew up, we realized that people want parts from these albinos. Yeah. A testimony was given recently. A woman who was sleeping, they went in, tried to cut off her fingers because they say that those are very good charms. These are things that, you know, as you're talking about, they need shelters, and I'm thinking, we don't even have them. Yeah. You're talking about child trafficking. Usually we concentrate, yes, laws exist in our countries, but usually we concentrate on the formal sector. I see every single day children accompanying elders to beg money in the country, and we are all watching. We know that people with disabilities are the people who are most sexually abused. I'm wondering, is it possible for you your network to reach, many other countries, or to help countries start addressing that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the observation. Quick responses, because we know the problem is so deep and complex and slightly varied in each country, but comes back to what are each and every one of us doing to make communities safer.
Yeah, the very important thing is the implementation. But the good thing when we are incorporating, because the UN protocol says at a minimum. So what does trafficking show in your country? We included child begging, use of children in those activities. We have removal of organs, because in some countries just removal for transplant. For us, it's removal also for rituals, witchcraft and all that, because those things happen. In my country, it can be witchcraft, but for you, it may be a different name. It will be magic. And so also the language on the things we say about what is happening around our countries, but also to be vigilant, because it's important to include it into law. Then you'll have a basis in which you can respond. You have a basis in which you can, say, government, hey, you're not channeling resources here. You have a basis of rallying, the community, because you show it as a problem. That's why child marriage is in our law as trafficking. Right. Yeah, so that's important.
Brief.
What I want to say is that sexual violence is real. No matter which country you come from, whether even Sweden, it's happening over there too, okay? You cannot pretend it's not happening. So each one of us, whether we are a man or a woman, we have to understand what is the whole spectrum of it, try and recognize it, okay? Make some effort to recognize it, know your rights, know your law, and do something if you see something going on, because it's about time that we stop this. As you can see that the implications of it are many. It definitely impacts more women than men. Men also get abused, but more women than men are impacted. And it really affects your quality of life, whether it's your mental health, your physical health, your mobility, your agency, etc. So each one of us has a responsibility to end it. Thank you.
And that's the imperative and the message that we leave you with this morning. Join me in thanking these extraordinary women.